My name is Paul Oliver. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products, and this is the installation instruction video for my extended runtime fuel kits for the 224cc dual fuel, dual voltage generators that are manufactured by the Zonson Group. Zonson Group does not sell their generators direct. They private label them to different brands such as PowerSmart and WEN and so forth. For the purpose of this video, I will be installing this kit on a WEN 6800, which is sold as 5300 watt continuous duty or 6800 watt peak. So let's go ahead and get started. Real quickly, if you're watching this video on YouTube and you'd like to get some more information, if you look in the description section right below the video, it has a link to my website. Go to my website, look at the product page. It has installation instruction videos, fine-tuning and troubleshooting videos, product demo videos, and a tremendous amount of text with just about anything you could possibly want. I also have a very good FAQ page on my website. If my website does not have the answer to your question, please contact me either by email or by phone. Please do not leave any questions in the comment section on the YouTube video. I do not monitor the comments on YouTube or any chat rooms. So if you'd like to leave a comment, then go ahead and do so. Okay, and the very first thing you're going to want to do is, in the kit is a flash drive, and it's got a copy of the video that we're shooting right now. So you'll go ahead and put this in your computer and play it, and you'll follow the steps as we go. So let's get started. Okay, the first step to installing this extended runtime fuel kit is to remove this side cover. The side cover is very simple to remove. There are two quarter-turn thumb screws at the top, and then you simply pull out on the cover and set the cover off to the side. The next step is going to be to remove this side cover, and again, there are two quarter-turn thumb screws. On this side, there's a recoil start rope, so you'll pull the recoil start rope out a little bit and then pull the cover loose. And what you'll do is you'll let the cover hang from the recoil start rope, and this way we can get access to what we need to get access to. The next thing we're going to do is to remove the hose that goes from the back of the selector valve to the carburetor. Before we remove the hose, we want to put the fuel selector valve at the off position, which will be to turn it all the way counterclockwise. The hose that we're going to remove is this one here with the big sleeve around it. And that's held on with a Corbin clamp. Okay, this is a Corbin clamp. There's two tabs on it. When you squeeze them with a pair of pliers, you notice the portion that goes around the hose opens up. When you release the pliers, it tightens up around the hose. So here's the hose that we just removed. Here's the hose we just removed. And here's the protective sleeve. So we're going to slide this protective sleeve off of the hose. Then we're going to go around the other side of the generator. This is the other end of the hose. We're not going to remove it from the carburetor. We're simply going to slide this hose out and let it hang out of this side of the generator for the time being. So you can see where it goes to the fuel inlet port. What we're going to do is remove the valve cover so we can disable the stock PCV valve. We will be putting an external PCV valve on it. So the first thing we do is squeeze this Corbin clamp, slide it back, remove the breather hose. We'll set this aside. We will be reinstalling it later. To remove the valve cover, pull the spark plug cap off and just set it aside. This Phillips head screw does not need to be removed. So the first thing we're going to do is pull the heat shield off, and that's held on with 4 bolts. The heat shield then lifts off. We will be reinstalling this later. Now we're going to remove the valve cover, and the valve cover is also held on with 4 bolts. Okay. We will now remove the valve cover and come over to the workbench and get ready to remove the PCV valve. The PCV valve is a little wafer or flap of metal. It's a reed that covers a hole right behind this metal plate. What we're going to do is we're going to bend this metal plate up, and then we're going to stick a screwdriver through that hole and pry back on the reed so that it damages it to the point where it cannot seat properly. You can't see it very clearly here in the video, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the breather plate, and that's strictly in order to video it. It is not necessary for you to remove the breather plate. In fact, it should be easier for you to do it straight through here. I'm just doing this so you can see what's going on. So slamming it against the counter has caused the breather plate to become dislodged from the valve cover. So now we're going to use a screwdriver to go ahead and pop the breather plate the rest of the way out. The reed valve that I was talking about is right behind this reed stop. There is a thin wafer of metal, which is the reed valve itself. I'm trying to get this probe behind it. There it goes. So I don't know if you can see it or not, but that was the thin wafer of metal opening up there. Hopefully you can see this thin wafer of metal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from this side, bend up this shield, and then go in with a flat blade screwdriver and catch under the edge of this and bend it back or kink it so that it is disabled, and the PCV valve internal to the engine will then be open all the time. So the first thing we'll do is bend this oil splash guard up out of the way just enough to do what we need to do. And now you can see the round hole that the reed valve is covering, and hopefully you can see the reed valve being pushed open with the screwdriver right here. So you'll want to look in through here, and you can see the reed valve from this viewpoint, and you'll know when you've got the reed valve disabled because you won't be able to see it anymore from this angle. And it may be easier if you use a flashlight to put some more light on this. So if you shine a flashlight in there, I don't know if it's washing the color out on the camera, but I can clearly see the reed valve. So what I'm going to do is take my screwdriver and I'm going to catch the corner or the side of that reed valve. I'm going to have to bend this splash guard up out of the way just a little bit more to get a better angle on it. And all I want to do is bend the reed valve. Okay, so now if you look at it, you can see the reed valve stop. And if you look at it from this angle, you can see the valve stop, and that's this plate. And this piece that is damaged underneath it is the reed valve itself, and that's exactly what you're trying to do. So now air can go both ways through this hole, which will create the pressure wave that oscillates the diaphragm on the fuel pump. And we'll put a new PCV valve external to the engine. So let me go in there with a screwdriver and just push this back just a little bit more. And as you can see from this angle here, we didn't have to get behind here. I simply did this to make it easier for you to understand what was going on. But now that the reed valve is fully open, we're going to take this little piece and just push it back down to where it used to be. So now our reed valve is completely disabled, and I'll go ahead and put our breather plate back into the valve cover. Now, if you were the ambitious type who decided to remove the breather plate, you'll notice that there is a rubber O-ring that needs to be put into place. As I stated earlier, you will not need to remove the breather plate from the valve cover. This can be done with the breather plate in the valve cover. So we will now push the breather plate back down into place. And now we're done. We have our PCV valve disabled, and we're ready to go ahead and bolt this back onto the engine. Okay, now simply as a test, before we bolt this back onto the engine, just to make sure you've got it done right, if you remember your original stock breather hose, take the Corbin clamp off of it and just blow through it. And you'll notice that there's no obstruction whatsoever. Then put the stock breather hose back into the valve cover, just like it was when it was on the engine, and blow in it. And you should feel almost no difference whatsoever between blowing through the hose and blowing through it when it's in the engine. If you feel a tremendous amount of resistance, then you notice there's no resistance. If you feel a tremendous amount of resistance, that's an indicator that you did not get the reed valve bent far enough open. If you'll notice, there is a piece of metal inside here. If you push this all the way in too far, it hits that piece of metal and puts resistance on it too. So you pull it out like 1/8 of an inch. and you have no resistance, and that's how I know that I've got the reed the reed valve bent back. And of course you're trying to bend back that tiny little wafer, not the entire reed stop, just that tiny little wafer so it does not close off the breather hole. So now we'll go ahead and bolt this back on the engine. Okay, so now before bolting the valve cover back on, we want to carefully check the valve cover gasket and make sure that we didn't tear it when we removed it. If you've got any damage to the valve cover gasket, the kit comes with a tube of Permatex gasket sealant. And you would put the gasket sealant on the valve cover, on the valve cover gasket, and on the valve cover itself. Be careful if you're putting gasket sealant on the valve cover itself. Do not cover this little oil return hole. That's critical that that not be covered. If that hole is covered, then it'll blow oil out of the engine as opposed to the oil return line, which is what that hole is for. And it'll fill the fuel pump full of oil and it won't pump fuel anymore. So now we're going to go ahead and put the valve cover back on and orient it so that the OHV, as in overhead valve, is right side up. And I'm going to go ahead and start all 4 bolts before I tighten any of them down. And go in a crisscross pattern so that you tighten the valve cover down evenly instead of pinching one corner down and then trying to rotate the rest of it down. Okay, once you get the valve cover on, then you're going to put the heat shield on. And it's also held on with 4 bolts. That was actually the trickiest part of this install. So now we get on to installing the fuel pump. In order to install the fuel pump, the first step is to take the spark plug cap, go ahead and put it back where it was originally installed, and make sure you feel it snap into place properly. This is the fuel pump. It's included in the kit. You'll notice that the pump has 2 ports that have caps on them, and those are going to be the fuel ports. This is going to be fuel going into the pump. This is going to be the pulse line, which is air in and out, and then this port is fuel coming out of the fuel pump. The fuel pump will be installed in the generator oriented like this, right into this location. So what I'm going to do is I am going to pre-assemble the hoses that come off of each of the ports so that we can slide the whole thing in there in one unit. It's actually a little bit easier to do that. Okay, we're going to take our fuel pump that we pulled the caps off of the input and output, Then included in the kit are two sections of hose. One is 3/16 hose, then the other is a 1/4 inch diameter hose. First thing we're going to do is cut a section of the 1/4 inch hose 5 inches long. We're going to install the 1/4 inch hose onto the output port of the fuel pump. And I've got just a little bit of oil here, which makes it a lot easier to slide the hoses into place. And you don't have to get the port completely covered, just get a little bit of oil on it. So now we've got 5 inch section of 1/4 inch hose. Next step, included in the kit, is a bag of small parts. This is a reducer to go from 1/4 inch to 3/16 hose. So we're going to get just a little bit of oil on this. And we're going to plug that into the end of the 1/4 inch hose. Now, as you remember, we removed a factory 3/16 hose from the fuel selector valve and left it hanging back out of the front of the generator. That hose is the one that's going to ultimately connect to here, and that's why we put the 3/16 reducer in place. The next step, we're going to take another section of the 1/4 inch hose, and it will be 11 inches long. So we've cut this to 11 inches long. We'll go ahead and get just a little bit of oil on the pulse port. And we put this hose onto the pulse port. And now we're going to cut another section of 1/4 inch hose, and we're going to cut that 8 1/4 inches long. Then we're going to get just a little bit of oil on the 3rd port of our fuel pump. And of course, that's the one that lets fuel into the pump. Then included in the kit is a fuel filter. And fuel flows in the direction of the arrow. So it'll flow from the tank into the fuel pump. So it will go on this hose that we just cut to 8 1/4 inches long. We'll put just a little bit of oil on that. And install it to where the arrows point toward the fuel pump. Okay, now what we're going to do is cut a piece of 1/4 inch hose 2 1/4 inches long. We'll dip the end of the fuel filter, just a tiny bit of oil, and slide this on. Then in the bag of small parts, we'll get the 1/4 inch T-fitting. We'll dip this spigot from the T-fitting into the oil and slide it onto the hose that went to the fuel filter. Orient this spigot like so, so it points the same direction as the fuel output port. Next, we're going to cut a piece of 1/4 inch hose 1 3/4 of an inch long. We're going to dump or dip the this spigot into the oil and put our 1 3/4 inch quarter-inch diameter hose onto this spigot. Then we have another adapter to go from 1/4 inch to 3/16. We're going to dip that adapter and we're going to plug it into the top of this section of hose that we cut to 1 3/4 inch. Now we're going to take our 3/16 hose and we're going to cut a section 2 inches long. I'm going to cut this one to 2.5 so that we've got room to adjust later on. Because if you cut it just a little bit long, it's easier and you'll have plenty of leftover hose. So then we're going to dip the other end of this adapter in the oil and put the 3/16 hose on here. Now we're going to take back to our 1/4 inch hose and cut an 8 1/4 inch section of 1/4 inch hose. Then we're going to dip this spigot of the T-connector, just a little bit of oil. Don't go dunking it all the way in. It's not necessary, and it just makes a mess that you have to clean up later. And spin the hose so where the natural curve is pointing the same direction, because ultimately they're going to go like this when it's installed. Okay, now it's time to start putting hose clamps on. The bag of small parts comes with 2 different sizes of hose clamp. There's the large clamp, which is for the 1/4 inch hose, and the smaller clamp, which is for the 3/16 hose. And the clamps work like this. You'll put them over the hose and just squeeze them down. If you need to remove the clamp, take one side in a pair of pliers, and I'll show you from this direction, and just push sideways on the other side, and it undoes. The kit is going to come with several hose clamps of both sizes and a bunch of zip ties. The zip ties and the hose clamps can be used interchangeably. However, the zip ties, the advantage is they are much thinner and lower profile, and there are certain places where this generator is just so tight that I prefer to use zip ties. There are other places where, in order to service, maintain, or repair the generator, the fact that the hose clamps are reusable, I prefer hose clamps. This hose right here, the output hose, is installed in a very tight position, and you'll see that later on. So I would urge you to use the zip tie in this location as opposed to the hose clamp. So we'll put the zip tie on and we'll cut the tag. Then this location is also extremely tight. So much so that I'm going to go ahead and wait till after we feed this hose through the guide loop before we even attempt to put a zip tie on it. It's that tight. The pulse line coming out of the top of the fuel pump, I'm going to put a hose clamp on, but I'm going to orient the hose clamp to where the clasp portion faces back. And you'll see why that is. Let me just get it started, and then we'll spin it around to the direction I want it to be. And I'll show you again once I get it installed so that you can clearly see what I'm talking about. Okay, so now you see that the clasp portion is facing away from you, and that's because the cover of the generator is so close that I don't want the clasp portion snagging. Then for the fuel inlet, we're going to use another hose clamp. You can use the zip ties here if you prefer. They are a lower profile, so they'll fit more easily. However, this area is not so tight that you absolutely need to use the zip ties. Then, on the fuel filter, I actually recommend using the clamps quite strongly, because that way you can unclamp and replace the fuel filter if you have debris or something in your fuel. That's the whole purpose of a fuel filter. So we will go ahead and put a clamp at each end of the fuel filter and orient the clamp so that the clasp is facing up when the whole assembly is laying right here. Let me show you something real quickly. When you clamp down on the clamps, if they end up looking kind of crooked like this, you can come back with a pair of pliers and squeeze side to side so that they'll line up straight on. And now we get to our T-fitting area. And this is going to be where the fuel inlet from the stock tank goes here. The fuel inlet from the remote tank goes here. So again, I'm going to put hose clamps here. You shouldn't need to ever service this or anything else, but it's nice to be able to disassemble it if you do decide that there's a need for that. And I'm going to angle this hose clamp clasp portion so it's all oriented. So if you can see the fuel pump here, it's going to be aimed a little bit back and at an angle. And that's to make it easier to fit when you go to assemble the whole thing. Then, at the top of the T-fitting, there's going to be another clamp, and it's going to be angled back at about a 45 also. So you can see that these two are about a 45-degree angle. The whole purpose of that was so that the third clamp can go straight up without having a problem with interference with the first two. Rotating them back at about a 45-degree angle gives you just enough clearance to make it easier. Then at the 1/4 inch side of the adapter, we use another large hose clamp. And I'm clamping it down with the clasp portion facing up as everything is laying on the workbench. Then we'll take one of the smaller hose clamps and put it on the smaller or 3/16 hose coming out of the adapter. So now your fuel pump assembly is assembled as it is going to go into the generator. I don't know if you saw or not, but my WD-41, I actually had a customer ask me if that was for real. Is there a new WD-41, a new and improved version? I had to explain that no, that's just a joke. So now we're going to go ahead and feed this into the generator. Okay, we're getting ready to install the fuel pump, and the fuel pump is going to be nestled in this area right here. I'd like to cover some things first off. This clear hose is a float bowl vent tube, and it goes along here, and it snaps into a bracket in the back of the cabinet, and then it continues down out the bottom of the generator. This clear hose is a float bolt drain. It also snaps into a bracket in the cabinet, continues out here. So now you know that if you bump these hoses loose during the next step, you know how they go. And let me show you something real quick. This hose actually snaps into this bracket right here, and you can unsnap it from the bracket if you're working on the generator. And we're going to be doing something similar to that later on. But you notice that that snapped right back in. This black hose that goes from the air box to a spigot on the fuel tank is a fuel tank vent. And then this black hose is the one that we removed from the back of the fuel selector valve earlier, the one that had the big heavy sleeve on this portion of it. And we've just got it up and out of the way for now, and we'll be hooking that up later on. So now, if we take our fuel pump that we assembled earlier, and this is the one we put together on the bench, we're going to take these two hoses and squeeze them together just a little bit, and we're going to feed them through this gap between the fuel tank, which is at the top, and the engine at the bottom. You'll notice that right here is a choke cable, and the choke cable runs right through here. We want it to go above the choke cable and above this choke cable bracket, this metal bracket. So we're going to go ahead and feed this through from this side. I'm going to let it sit just like that. Then we're going to go around to the other side of the generator. We're going to reach in. We're going to grab our 1/4-inch hose and then come over here and get our 3/16 hose. And now both hoses are visible through this window. Now we'll go back to the other side of the generator. You see the black grommet right here, and right above it is a window with an orange bracket behind it. So if you take your finger and you stick it in front of this wire, you got a wire right here, so you're going to stick it between this bracket and that wire, and you'll notice that your finger is now visible through that grommet. Then if you curve up, you notice your finger is now visible through this bracket here. We're going to feed this fuel hose right where my finger is. So now you'll see it's through the gap by the grommet, and then we'll curve up, and now you can see it coming through this area here. And now we want to pull it back around so we can put our 3/16 hose onto it, like I described when we were assembling this on the workbench. Just a little bit tight. And there we go. And now this is the 3/16 to 1/4-inch adapter. So we're going to push the fuel pump in, and it's now nestled right in this area where I told you it would be nestled at. And this is our fuel output from the pump to the carburetor. This is our pulse line, which will go to the new breather line and new PCV valve. And this is the fuel inlet that comes from the tank into the fuel pump. So now if we come back around to this side, we just want to make sure that these hoses are where we can get at them. And sure enough, they are. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is come around and make sure that this 3/16 hose is the appropriate length. Okay, and that's the one that I said I was going to cut about a 1/2 inch longer, because it's always easy to shorten it, not easy to lengthen it when you're done. And it feels like it is a little too long. I'll trim that later when I get ready to assemble that. Okay. So now if you come around here, remember this is the hole that the original breather hose used to go through. So we're going to take a section of the 1/4-inch hose, and remember when I took the stock breather hose and pushed it in here and blew in it, I explained that there was a plate inside the valve cover area. Well, because I don't want this hose to hit that plate and be snuffed off, so to speak, I'm going to cut the 1/4-inch hose at an angle like this. So as it pushes in there, it'll hit, and you're still going to, even if it hits that plate straight on, it's still going to be able to flow air. I'm going to trim this off just a little bit because that's quite a sharp angle on that. So now as it pushes in, it'll go like this. So I'm going to push this in now, and if you remember, the plate is actually attached to the breather plate. So I'm going to push this in so that this area faces toward me. And we want this to go into the breather at least to about here, so it'll lock itself in on the next step. Okay. So now I've got it in, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this off to where it's only about 1/8 of an inch showing out, and you'll see why later. Okay. Now if you come over here, this is the PCV valve, the new one that we're going to be putting in. This is the barb that's going to go into the hose that we just installed. So as you remember, the hose goes into the valve cover. When this barb pushes in, it will flare just inside the valve cover and hold that hose into the valve cover. So we're going to dip this end in just a little bit of oil. And we're going to push it into this hose here. We're going to smear some oil on it. And we're going to push it into place. Now I'm going to need a little more oil. There it goes. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is push just as a test. Put our finger over this. Put the original breather hose onto here, or a section of our 1/4-inch hose, and it doesn't have to go all the way on, and just blow in it really hard and make sure that we've got free airflow so that this hose isn't pushed up solidly against that plate, because we want to have air to be able to flow in there. So we're going to cover this and just blow in it. It helps if we take the dipstick out. And it flows freely. Okay. So now, put that cover back on and clean up our mess. Okay, if you do that, you may make a bit of a mess. However, it's critical to make sure that that hose flows freely, because if it doesn't flow freely, your whole system won't work. So it's good to check it right here, right now. Makes your life a lot easier. So now this is the pulse line. So we're going to tuck it right up in here in this area behind the cabinet, and then come down and go onto this barb of the T-fitting. So I'm going to take just a little bit of oil, Put it on the barb of the T-fitting. And we want the hose to go in a nice progressive loop, no sharp kinks to it. And that is snapped onto the T-fitting. And now we're going to take the stock breather hose that in the first part of the video was snapped onto here and tucked into the valve cover. And we're going to cut it right here. So now this hose will go back onto here, and this end will go to the new PCV valve. So now our breather hose goes, it used to have a PCV valve in the valve cover, which we disabled, so it used to go through that PCV valve and then through this hose into the intake manifold. Well, now it comes out of the valve cover as a live pressure and vacuum line, then it goes through the PCV valve and then into the intake manifold. And then we have a port coming off of it that is alternating pressure and vacuum, which oscillates the diaphragm in the fuel pump. So I'm going to go ahead and put a zip tie around this connection right here, because it is such a tight area and zip ties just take up less room than the hose clamps. We pulled that tight, and then we'll cut the tail off of it. Now, if you remember this hose that we passed right behind this rubber grommet and through this section, we're going to reach in with our finger and we're going to hook it and pull it out. Now, as you remember, when we assembled this, I said this was so tight that we couldn't get a clamp on here yet. So now that we've got it in place, I'm going to put a zip tie there because it's still tight, but at least we can get at it. Okay, so that zip tie is on there. Later, I'm going to go ahead and cut the tail off that zip tie, but right now, having that zip tie there makes it a lot easier to pull that hose in and out of where I want it at. So this hose is the 3/16 hose that goes to the carburetor inlet. So we're going to leave just enough hose to run into a nice gentle arc and then plug onto this 3/16 spigot. So I'm going to cut the hose what I think will ultimately work best. I'm just testing it for length right now. Okay. Keep in mind when you cut this, if you cut it too long, you can always shorten it. If you cut it too short, you're going to start using words you can spell, or words that I can spell at any rate. Okay, so now I'm going to take the original Corbin clamp that was on this hose when it went to the fuel selector valve. I'm going to take my zip tie, pull down on it, and slide the 3/16 hose onto that adapter. And then I'm going to push it up into place just to see if the length is right and it's a nice smooth radius bend, no kinks anywhere. That actually feels really nice. So now I'm going to pull back out on here, slide that hose the rest of the way onto the hose barb, and then slide the Corbin clamp into place. So now you see that our 3/16 hose is all the way to the stop on the adapter. We'll squeeze Corbin clamp, then release it so it's clamped into place. We'll do one last check, and that's nice and smooth. Okay. Right in here, there's another clamp that you can push the hose back toward the camera, and now it's snapped into this bracket here too. If it's not snapped into that bracket, there's no harm to it. But if it is snapped in there, it's just one more bracket to hold it. If you need to remove it, you just take something and you push in on the front of this, and it pushes the hose back out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the tail off the zip tie now, because I no longer need it out there. I'm going to go back in there, and I'm going to tuck this back into this bracket. And this one works the exact same way these do, but just on a larger scale. It's a larger bracket for a larger hose. So the hose from the output of the fuel pump goes right behind here, through this slot, into this snap bracket, connects to the 3/16 hose, makes a nice gentle arch back to here. So now we can go to the other side and hook up our fuel inlet hoses. Okay, so we have our 3/16 hose, and that's going to go to the barb on the back of the fuel selector valve that we removed the original 3/16 hose from. And I'm just going by feel on here right now. I want to make sure that the hose is not kinked and runs a nice smooth arc. And I've got about a 1/2 inch too much hose, which, as you remember when we assembled it on the bench, I said I was going to leave the hose about a 1/2 inch longer so I could always trim it off if need be. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to trim about a 1/2 inch off of this. You don't want to cut your thumb off. And there's the section that I cut. Now, because it's just a little tight in there, I'm going to take the small clamp and I'm going to squeeze it to where we've got one notch of the clip into place. I'm going to slide it over this hose. Then I'm going to slide this hose onto the back of the barb for the fuel selector valve. And then I'm going to reach in there with a pair of pliers and squeeze that hose clamp shut as well. What I'm doing is I'm going by feel. Okay, so the hose is now onto the barb. Hold it just like this so I can see the flashlight. So now if you look, you'll see that the first large clamp is at the 1/4 inch side of the adapter. Then this small clamp here is at the 3/16 side of the adapter. And then this clamp here is on the hose barb on the back of the fuel selector valve. So now we'll come back around and we'll deal with this, which is going to be the hose to the remote tank. Okay, so now we're coming to the home stretch. It's the mounting of the quick disconnect inlet fuel port. You'll notice that I really like Zonson generators. They're well thought out, they're well done, they're well built. This is the smallest dual fuel, dual voltage generator that I am aware of. And because of that, the cabinet is very small. So the locations to put the quick disconnect inlet port, you're very limited. You can't put it along the top here because the fuel tank is right behind that and there's simply no room. If you were to put it sticking straight out from the side anywhere in here, it would stick out enough that you could catch your knee on it or something like that, or snag on it as you're walking along. Behind the control panel, there's no room. It's filled with wiring. Behind these inlet ducts, there is an inverter module, so there's no way to put it there. And then again on this side, the fuel tank is in the top. And of course, on this side here, you don't want it sticking out either. You can't put it in the back because then you would have a fuel hose hanging across a hot exhaust. The only viable solution on this generator is right here is a recessed area, and there's a hole drilled up at an angle. So what we're going to do is enlarge that hole that's drilled up at an angle so that the quick disconnect port, when not being used, you would push it up into here and it would be quite recessed. It would be functional that way. And then when you wanted to use it, you would take it and you'd slide it out a little bit and snap your fuel hose onto it. So that's how we're going to handle it. We're going to drill this hole out large enough that the quick disconnect port will mount in that location. Okay, so the first step is we're going to drill this hole out large enough that this hose barb will fit through it. And I'm going to stick my fingers back here just to make sure where all the fuel hoses are, because I don't want to snag a fuel hose with this drill bit. Okay, one step larger. A little bit larger yet. Okay. Okay. So now the hose barb will pass through here. Okay, what we want to do now is take the Teflon tape included in the kit and wrap it around the threads of the quick disconnect fitting. And we want to be real careful not to overlap the end of the threads. Specifically, you don't want it to come over like that, because then when you screw the hose barb on, it will shear off a small piece of Teflon tape, which will then get lodged in the fuel filter. It won't do any damage per se, but it'll just clog up the fuel filter early. So then we're going to screw the hose barb onto our quick disconnect fitting and thread it down tight. and that's pretty tight. And then we're going to take this piece of 1/4-inch hose, which, as you remember from the assembly on the workbench, we had cut that hose to 8 to 8 1/4 inches, which will give you enough room to cut off any if it's just a little too long. So you'll take your quick disconnect fitting and slide it in here and do a test fit. Okay, on my particular generator, it worked out real nice. Depending on how far back you've got the fuel pump positioned and so forth, you may wind up cutting this hose just a little bit short. So I'm going to put the hose clamp onto it, and then I'm going to slide the hose barb into the hose. And what this is going to do is going to give us just enough adjustment, and I'll show you in a minute here, to pull this quick disconnect fitting out to snap onto it. Or tuck it in place when you're running off of the stock tank or when you're transporting the generator somewhere. So when the quick disconnect is tucked in, it would be like this. When you're using it, you can slide it out just far enough that you can get the hose to snap in place on it. Okay? So now we will go ahead and cut a hole in our panel that should just match up with the outer ring of this orange panel, and that way it'll look aesthetically pleasing. So let's go ahead and get started on that. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to cut a hole in this outside panel that lines up with this circle here. So I have measured from this chrome edge over 1 1/4 inch to right here, and then from this chrome lip down 1/4 inch to right here. And that's my crosshairs where I'm going to put a hole. We'll see if my hole lines up in the exact right spot. If it doesn't line up in the exact right spot, then you know to adjust your measurements. Or what you can do is pull it out a little bit and sight it, looking down here and back and forth wherever it needs to be here, and then sight it from the end, looking for up and down to center this hole where it needs to be. So what I'm going to do is we'll pull out on the recoil start rope, and I will clamp it off so it doesn't fight with me when I'm drilling the hole. And now I will take my hole saw. I'm starting with a 2-inch hole saw, and I'm going to drill a hole in this outer cabinet. And now what I'm going to do is deburr this hole. So now let's deburr the hole. We don't want to take a whole lot off. Okay. Now comes the moment of truth. When we see if we got the hole in the right spot. Now I'm going to say no. We should have gone up 1/4 of an inch and over 1/4 of an inch. So when you guys do that, I measured over 1 1/4 and down 1/4. I think it would be much more appropriate to put the hole dead even with this chrome line here and over 1 inch from this chrome line, so that the hole will be moved into the appropriate spot. As a result of me drilling it in the wrong spot, I'm going to need to make an egg-shaped hole in this cover, which is not as aesthetically pleasing as we'd like, but it will function. So let me go ahead and trim that. Try it again. Hopefully it'll be closer. Okay, if we had drilled it at this spot in the first place, it would be a perfectly round hole that lines up in front of the fuel quick disconnect port. So, center of it, dead even with this, and the vertical alignment would be 1 inch back from this edge of the chrome. Of course, this would look a lot better if I hadn't drilled the hole in the wrong spot in the first place. But on yours, use the updated measurements, which is 1 inch back from this chrome line and over exactly even with this chrome line. But to use the remote fuel tank, you'd snap the quick disconnect fitting from the remote tank onto the port, and for storage or transporting, you'd tuck it in. And this way it doesn't stick out past the cover. And like I said earlier, if you drill the hole in the right place in the first place, unlike I did, it really does not look unaesthetically pleasing. You've got an orange area recessed in here, and the rest of the cabinet is orange framing this and so on. But if you line this hole up better than I did, you should work out pretty well. The last part of it is to put the instruction decal on this side of the generator. And I like to put the instruction decal on the same part of the generator as the fuel inlet port. I think people are more likely to read it if it's positioned right next to the fuel inlet port. And of course on this generator it's also right next to the fuel selector valve. So everything that this decal pertains to is on this side of the generator. And now the very last part of this install is to put this side cabinet in place, and you snap the snap fittings and then turn the quarter turn thumb screws. Okay, so that just about wraps it up. If you've watched this video on YouTube and you'd like to get more information on this product, look in the description section right below the video, and you'll see a link that takes you to my website where I have a product page that has several videos on this product. I have a lot of text on this product, and I also have an excellent FAQ page which will give you more information. If you still don't see what you're looking for, contact me by email, and my email and my phone number are listed on my website. However, please do not attempt to contact me through YouTube's comment section. I do not monitor YouTube comments or any of the chat rooms. I simply don't have the time. If you have a relevant comment about this product that does not require a reply, then definitely go ahead and leave it in the comments section. But if you'd like a reply from me quickly, then get a hold of me by phone or get a hold of me by email, and I can answer any questions you may have. I thank you so much for your time.